So, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It's our pleasure to introduce our speaker, Stella Porto, from the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. Okay. In this presentation, Stella will introduce MEiRA, the Impact Evaluation and Recognition Framework for Applied Learning. This webinar is being recorded. We will record Stella's presentation, and then we will stop the recording before the question and answer session. But feel free to ask your question at the end, or even in the chat during the presentation. I will check all the questions during the presentation. So thank you, Stella, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you for the invite. For those who don't know, I've been working with Eric for quite some time now, I think since 2021. So this presentation is about other things, but also related to my work with using Open Badge Factory. So thank you for that. So the focus of this presentation is to use badges to go beyond recognizing completing a course and using for a very particular use, which is a challenge for a lot of educators, to try to measure the effectiveness and the impact and the results of the learning that we offer. And so what I'm going to present to you is a methodology, and within that methodology, we use badges. So let me see if when I click here, I'm advancing or not. Is it? Yes. So I'm going to start talking about why MEiRA was created. The acronym, MEiRA is an acronym, but it's an acronym in Spanish. I work for, I would say 90% of our audience is Spanish speaking. So we looked at acronyms in English and in Spanish, and in Spanish it worked way better. So the letters are for Marco de Evaluación de Impacto y Reconocimiento del Aprendizaje Aplicado. Bien, that's why it's MEiRA. And actually, interesting enough, MEiRA is actually a last name sometimes found in the peninsula, in Portugal and in Spain. So I'll explain the framework. Then I will go into the use of badges in particular with specifics of implementations using badges. I'll give some examples of things that we're extracting from using this methodology, and then a little bit of where we're going with this. What have been our challenges, some of the things we have changed. And especially I want to present this in a way that allows people to consider this and actually maybe adapt it to their own context, because there's a lot of elements here that don't have to be implemented in the exact way that we're doing. All right, so first, for those that don't know what a development bank is, I just wanted to give like a parenthesis here, which is why is a development bank, involved in learning, recognition, and measuring impact. So a development bank is a bank that finances projects in development in certain regions. So you have the World Bank, and the Inter-American Bank does this with Latin America and the Caribbean. Okay, so that's why Spanish is so important to us. But there is an aspect of a development bank that is also important to understand, because you have a lot of specialists that are producing knowledge every day in all sorts of areas related to development. So every dollar we lend is amplified when you have governments that have the knowledge to design better policies, implement better programs, strengthen the projects. So we provide not only learning related to those topics, we also want to recognize achievements, and then measuring impact of what we do becomes really key. So that's why we're in this business. So why does MEiRA exist internally? we have, as within the bank, the aspect of measuring effectiveness and measuring impact has always been important, but has in recent years become even more important. It doesn't matter if you have a lot of people and you're reaching a lot of people if you don't have a way to really impact those people. And how do you know if you are impacting people if you don't measure it? So the idea of MEiRA really aligns with not only measuring, but also using the information of these measurements to improve what you're offering. So not only you can say, okay, I'm doing something and these are the stories of impact, but also I can say, well, here's where I can do better in terms of what I'm offering to get more impact. So this is how it aligns to comprehensive learning evaluation and also achieving those effective policies and programs. So for those who come from distance education or any area of training, we always, when we talk about evaluating effectiveness or measuring impact, there's a lot of limitations, right? So very commonly you will find people talking about Kirkpatrick and those different levels and implementing those levels. And those kind of methodologies, there are other methodologies, but a lot of those methodologies, they work very well when you're talking about training within an organization and where you can control, you know, the people that are taking the training, you know where they're going, you know the roles that they will be taking, and you can then follow up with them and even ask their supervisors, you know, do surveys and see if the training that you have offered really has some impact. So this relates not only to this organizational setting, but also the kind of training that you're producing, that you can really have direct measures of impact. So there's a lot of restriction in those methodologies. They're very narrow, and they're usually very reliant on quantitative aggregated measures. You don't talk about people individually, and they are not the owners of their story of learning and that using of learning. So why I'm mentioning these things, it's because these elements that I'm mentioning that are not in these methodologies are really at the heart of what I'm going to explain about MEiRA. MEiRA is really an attempt to measure at an individual level and allowing participants of learning not only to showcase their how they're using what they have learned, but really tell their stories from their own voice. So there is a very different aspect here that we are pursuing with this methodology. So because of these, and when we started trying to develop a framework, it came about because of these limitations that I mentioned, because we don't have that situation. We are offering learning to a very large audience in a regional setting. So I can't even know which country I can know which country they're coming from, but I can't limit that in many of the cases. So very diverse population. So all of these things contributed for us to go to another route to find ways of telling stories of impact. So without too much of an introduction, this is the image that we use to tell what MEiRA is. And for those who know Kirkpatrick or know any other framework, you will identify a lot of elements that come from those methodologies that are in here. But we go a little bit beyond that, and like I said, we focus on these individual stories. So MEiRA has 5 pillars, and these 5 pillars start during the learning. So place yourself with parts of this methodology happening during the learning, and then parts of it happening after the learning has been completed, the learning, the formal learning. So we start with engagement. And engagement is a measure of the participation of people within the learning. And you will recognize here that although we are focused on online learning, this doesn't have a limitation for online learning. You could measure all these things if it's done face-to-face. So engagement. Then we have perception and appreciation, and that is usually measured through asking people, doing surveys and asking people what they, how they appreciated the learning that they have, all from their perspective. If they feel they have achieved their objectives, if they like the instructor, all these questions that we usually ask at the end of the learning. So you'll see these are very similar things that we have in Kirkpatrick, right? Then we move to the third pillar, that is cognition and knowledge acquisition. And this is the measure within the setting of learning if people have achieved the objectives that were proposed for the learning situation. Okay, so these three pillars, you see them highlighted with this orange circle. This data is all collected during the course, okay, during the training or during the learning situation, because this can be whatever you want it to be. Then we move to after. And this is where I would say that the real new thing comes with MEiRA. So after the course is completed, we have two other pillars. The first one is what we call intention and commitment. And what we want to measure there is how people plan to use the learning. And in doing that, I want you to understand this as a learning journey. So every time we do these interventions after the course, we are not doing them as observers. We are really being very active in the process of pushing people a little bit more. So that's why MEiRA is not only a framework for measuring evaluation, it is a new concept for the learning journey, because I am still actively pushing people to do things with what they have learned. So I measure, but I'm also trying to get them to another level. So with intention and commitment, that happens afterwards, and then we can discuss how much time we do this. This is another aspect of this framework. I ask them, give me a plan, and I try to do this in a very structured way. Give me a plan of what are your intentions of using this. And this is all, people only participate in these activities after the formal learning if they want to. They're not forced to. These are all, people are invited to participate. So intention and commitment is this plan. And then finally, the fifth pillar is I give, after they have given me the plan, I come back and I ask them, okay, so you had this plan. I gave you a little bit of time. It can't be a lot, and I'll tell you later why. Tell me, what have you been able to use and how? And tell me your story of applying what you have learned. And this is why we call this fifth pillar transfer and impact stories, because this is the actual transferring of learning to a real world situation. So 5 pillars, 3 pillars within the learning situation, 2 pillars, 2 interactions with the learners after, and then one more element here that is important. There are 3 situations here in which we use badges. I didn't talk about badges yet, but there are 3 important situations. So the first one is when people finish the course, and that's the one that people usually know and use more, this kind of digital badge, right? You finish your learning, you have fulfilled the assessments, and I send you a badge. So with MEiRA, I have 2 other opportunities to recognize people. So I ask them for the plan, they submit a plan, I see if this plan was not done in the back of a handkerchief or a napkin. And I say, okay, you have really showed me a plan that makes sense to use what you have learned, and I recognize you for that. And this is the second badge in this learning journey. And then finally, with the fifth pillar, when they submit the evidence and they tell the story of how they have used what they have learned, then they are recognized again. And so there are 3 instances now of recognition through digital badges. Okay, so I'll come back to this. So badges then become a way of assessing. That's where I started, right? I want to evaluate the learning, and I can evaluate if these people are able to plan to use it, and then they tell their story. So I'm also evaluating the impact, the stories of impact. But badges here become also these markers of a larger learning journey. And I tell this with a little bit of almost as if this is a second thing, because when we started working in this framework, we weren't thinking of the learning journey. And as we developed this framework, the learning journey just popped as almost being the primary thing that we should be looking for. Because in a way, what is our challenge as educators is really to make people learn and then continue their learning, right? The learning has to continue to make sense of why did we do this. And so looking at measurements as part of a continuous learning journey really made this into something very different, and not just an evaluation of getting data and then moving on, but really connecting with people and doing these interventions in a way that we're helping them advance their learning. So you can look at MEiRA from this perspective of learning, and you can look at MEiRA as also instruments of measurement. And they're both things at the same time. So there are 3 strategic recognition moments: the course when you end the learning, your commitment and your intention to apply what you have learned, and then finally, what we call the applied learning impact. You tell a story of having used what you have learned. So each badge tells a story of progression of the learning. First, I understand. I have achieved these learning objectives, which are not usually real world because we can't do real world during the learning situation. And then we start looking at what happens afterwards. So this is evidence-based recognition, and it's really meaningful validation because the story of that individual is told there. And when we finally developed this framework, we thought of all these situations, and I lived this when I was in academia and universities, and I also go through this at the bank, that we go after people later on to ask for their testimonies. You don't need those testimonies because this is way bigger than the testimonies, So all that search that we do later on, this is actually doing it as part of a methodology. And another aspect of this is that usually when you look at Kirkpatrick and other methodologies, they're very focused in, okay, I've evaluate that this is effective, and then I move on. I don't need to measure this anymore. But with MEiRA, because it's a learning journey, if you measure once and you don't do it anymore, you're saying that these other people that are taking the course or the training, in another edition of your offering, they're not going to get the same experience because this is a different journey. So it makes this process, it completely changes the proposition of the learning in the first place. And it says, no, you learn here, but then we continue. And as I continue, I also continue to evaluate. So it's a really different mindset, you know. It's not a mindset of someone that measures and, okay, this is good and I can move on. It's really a different kind of engagement in thinking of evaluation as also related to this learning process. And also a big difference, like I mentioned before, it's really focused on empowering people, right, to make their achievements visible. In another situation, they might be applying what they have learned, but no one knows. No one will know if you don't go there and try to make it visible. All right, so this is, I'll make a parenthesis here. Maybe you haven't seen this, probably not. But a couple of years ago, when we went into our journey of using badges, we developed a taxonomy. Okay. And we had a taxonomy of what our badges were for. And this was very useful because we have many. And I just want to make a comment that when we developed MEiRA, just to show how this life with badges is an evolving world. When we developed MEiRA, we felt the need to go back to our taxonomy and really define two other kinds of badges, because the pillar 4 and the pillar 5 of what we measure afterwards really required a completely different kind of badge, because we are really asking very specific things to people related to what they have learned. So those who do instructional design out there, you know, the badges for these pillars after the course, they're all aligned with the learning objectives. So it's full instructional design work there to think of these badges. So we added two other classes of badges that they would make sense in our entire framework. And these are shown here. Okay, so going back to MEiRA, how do we implement MEiRA in like a timeline, right? So this is a little bit of what I've explained, but with more explanation. So we start with engagement. You know, if it's online, we're using the LMS with a lot of analytics there about participation. Then when we move to perception and appreciation, we are measuring satisfaction and surveys, etc. Then in cognition, that's when we are going to send the first badge. We do the measurements through tests, you know, the different learning activities and so forth. And then at the end of the learning, we send them a badge. Now, afterwards, we have to go after these people, and I'll talk about a little bit more of where this happens, because this is important. We do the pillar 4 intervention, and we ask them, we give them an instrument. And this instrument is basically a series of questions. You know, it's very structured. It's not like tell me whatever, because this has to be aligned with the learning objectives. So the questions that we ask about planning to use come all the way from the needs assessment that was done for the learning. For those who do instructional design, you know, the first phase of the ADDIE model, you know, where you do the needs analysis, all of that information that's from the needs analysis comes into play here, that you can say, okay, what would a person that learned this, how would they prepare themselves to use what they have learned? So all of that information has to be collected way there in the beginning. So we have the instruments for intention and commitment, and very similar instruments. You know, usually we give them a form. They can provide attachments. They can provide proof of things. It will really vary depending on the context. These are not standard instruments here. They are really made for the particular kind of learning in the particular context. And throughout this period that we go after the course, we are in communication with them. So it is still contact. You know, we first ask them if they want to participate. If they want to participate, we say, okay, now you will continue this work here. We send them reminders. We offer support. Sometimes they don't understand what they, people sometimes don't even know that their initial thoughts about using something that they learned is already worth being documented. So it's even telling them, yes, this is evidence. You know, explaining what an evidence is. And then finally, the stories. And about the timing here that I mentioned before, that the timing is really crucial here. So, in one hand, you want to give people time because we know that learning requires sort of digesting, right, of things. But on the other hand, as you will remember, when you're trying to measure something, you can't distance yourself too much from the learning because otherwise you can't make that attribution really work. How will you tell that, you know, this planning and these stories are really related to the learning if this is done like 2 years after the learning, right? So there is a time here that is crucial. We can't be too far out, okay? But we can't be too close either. So what we have done is we look at the kind of learning. There are a couple of learning situations that you see that people can apply very quickly, and there are others that they require a little bit more of time. So usually what we do is that the commitment to apply is not distant. We give them an amount, a limited amount of time. So if a person finishes the course, you know, we do this with self-paced courses, so people finish at their own timing. Immediately after they finish, we invite them to participate in this phase of commitment. But we give them some time. You know, it's a couple of weeks. It's usually max a month, not too far out. They need to be still in the mindset of the course to be able to tell how they plan to use it. And then the timing afterwards, the timing to tell, to show have the evidence of having applied what they learned, that will depend a little bit on what they have said and also a limited amount of time. But usually that will not go beyond a couple of months. Otherwise, we're really too distant from the learning to be able to have that attribution that I mentioned before. So just for you to have an idea of what an instrument is, it's like this. This is, you can't see it very well, but it's just so you know it's a form. And we ask questions, and there are boxes that they fill in, and they might attach a document. So before, when the early days of MEiRA, we have been doing this for more than a year now, we were using a feature of Open Badge Factory that is called badge application, which is basically a badge application. It's a very, very interesting feature in Open Badge Factory that for those who don't know, maybe Emily can send them a link that explains what it is. But it's basically a form in which you say, I want to be recognized for this. And I give you, and you send something, and it's like a badge by demand, right? Instead of being something that I just issue a badge after something, the user needs to do something and request the badge. So actually, badge application can be used in many situations, and we have used it throughout. For MEiRA, we started out with the badge application, and it was very useful, but our courses are in Moodle. So we found after a lot of trials that it was better to move these instruments of the Pillar 4 and Pillar 5 all into the setting of the course, into the same kind of environment for the learning. So we have been implementing them within Moodle. So these forms here are implemented in Moodle. And that was easier for people to find where things are happening and continue to be engaged with the process of the course. So I won't go too much into the tech thing. But as I said, all of this can be implemented in a different way. I mean, you could have, for all I know, a WhatsApp group that you talk to people if you have their contacts there. Like this can be implemented in different ways. So the idea really of implementing MEiRA is really moving from evidence to recognition, right? So we have a structured validation that makes these badges, you know, and I want to make Eric very happy here because I have been listening to him talk throughout the years about badges are not transactional, they have to be meaningful and so forth. And I think this is the use of badges that is really powerful in terms of showing people's growth, right? The idea of the mini e-portfolio for those who are from those times enjoying e-portfolios. So the evidence collection starts with these structured forms that were kind of guiding people to show their commitment and then tell their stories. We usually allow very different kinds of evidence. For example, we have some courses that it's things that are very specific to certain areas of regulation, for example. And we allow people to have evidence that, you know, I didn't have the opportunity to use it specifically, but you know, I shared this in my working place. This is an evidence of, right, taking what you have learned and moving forward with it within your workplace. So we talk to specialists in different areas and we develop a whole series of various evidences that can be used by participants. Then, you know, learners will craft their own impact story. So that's the idea of the empowerment and having the very individual stories told there. So you will have the context really having to be explained and the challenges that people face. You know, sometimes, you know, I want to apply this, but I only, you know, my team is very small. So these are the very small steps we took. And it's really telling people that sometimes to get to a bigger impact, you need to have smaller steps. And these smaller steps have meaning. You need the small steps to get to the big ones. Then the process of validation is done with the specialists that we work with in developing these courses. So we work with rubrics that are very, you know, in tune with what we want to measure. We are actually now to be able to scale this, and I'll talk about scalability. We've been starting to use AI to help us, you know, identify patterns or even do the evaluation. So the quality assurance there about this, the validation. And then finally, having badges. So those instruments, like you saw, that they're very structured. We use all this information to really have badges that are very rich in data. You know, why, you know, it's always the conversation I have with people that don't know what badges are is what is the difference between a badge and a certificate? And I always say, yeah, there is the metadata and data, but also the richness. You see a lot of badges being developed by people that haven't thought through, and the badges have nothing in there. Why develop a badge that is poor in information if you have an instrument that is exactly it exists to provide comprehensive information about what is being recognized? So the badges here are developed in a very rich way using all the information that we have used to develop the instruments. This also is reflected in the badge that is used, that is issued for these professionals. So how all of that, how the MEiRA is connected, and I already mentioned instructional design here a couple of times, but I can't say less about instructional design because it's really at the heart of all this. So the work of implementing MEiRA within a course, for example, really starts at the beginning. I would even go to the point to say that what we're doing in terms of needs analysis now has changed because of MEiRA. I ask different questions when we're doing our needs analysis, because I need all this information about the real world use of the learning to be able to develop those instruments that will be used later on for those pillars after the learning ends. So all this phase of alignment and design are, at the beginning of everything. Then, as I will continue to say, we are engaged with these people after the course ends. So we do a lot of planning and creating communication strategies to know when we start talking to these people, to develop the wording that we use. Sometimes depending on the course, people, these are professionals that have full-time work, that have families, so learning is not their top priority. And sometimes you need to have a kind of wording that motivates them to continue this after the course has ended. So there's a whole phase there about planning and communication strategy. And finally, the deployment of the instruments, the data collection and analysis. So all these three things are important during the implementation. So here's an example. I just wanted to show, this is a course that we have developed in actually the 4 languages that we have at the bank, but in this case we use 3 languages. This course has been developed in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And it's a course about generative AI, like a beginner's course. And it's a self-paced course. And this is the kind of situation where the learning can very immediately be used. We have other courses that the learning takes a little while to actually, people start using. But I suppose that all of you, or many of you, use AI, generative AI for something, if not for everything. And you know that as soon as you learn it, you can start using for anything, right? And then obviously to use in your workplace, true, you have sometimes some limitations and some policies, etc. But it is something that you can apply very readily. So we have developed, in this case, we have applied MEiRA, and it has been one of our very successful cases because this is a beginner's course and people immediately are able to tell stories of improvement in their workplace and their commitment to use what they have learned here. So here are some stories I asked Andrea, who works with us, to collect some stories, and these are all translated because these are all from Spanish-speaking countries. And so, for example, Ministry of Energy in Trinidad and Tobago developed no-code chatbot for public service. Another one telling of personal impact. I'm continuing to developing these skills. I'm using AI to do narratives. We built community of practice that now is driving buy-in into AI initiatives. So you see here how the kinds of evidence you see, like this last one, that is not really related to using AI itself, but my learning has allowed me to expand, adopting AI initiatives within my workplace. So these are different kinds of narratives that we have collected. Now, these are just snippets from, larger things, like I showed you, the big forms, right, that they have to fill out. Another example, just so you know that the topics that we work with are very different from one another. This is a course that people learn about criminal data in criminal analysis situations. And we also have applied MEiRA here. And so, the 3 badges there, they're one after the other, the course, the intention and commitment. And here you see that we, in terms of design of the badge, we continue with a design that are very similar. We have been calling, in most cases, the intention and commitment we changed the name to call it strategical competency, right? And then when we move to the last one, we have been calling professional competency. Actually, this is switched. I'm sorry here. This should be the strategic is the intention and commitment, and the professional is the last one. But anyway, just to show that these are different badges, but they carry a lot of the design elements of the badge from the course itself. So again, a couple of quotes from Impact in this course, you know, internal processes of terminology in analytical crime situations, leadership and training within the organization. This course is really focused on defining terminology, so that's why they mentioned this many times. Optimize internal documentation, incorporate criminal analysis into processes. And so these are a few of the uses of this course. So I will continue. I have something to tell about adoption and challenge and so forth, but let me stop a little bit because I know I've run really over time. If maybe I want to answer a couple of questions, because now I'm going to go into where, you know, how many we have done and the challenges we have faced. So are there any questions, Emily?
Yeah, thank you very much, Stella, for this presentation. I will stop the recording just to jump for questions.